Long before the Silk Road became a fabled artery of commerce connecting east and west, the lands it would traverse were vast, enigmatic, and in many ways untamed. The story begins not with silk or spices, nor with caravans laden with gold or horses, but with the stirrings of human ambition and ingenuity across the great steppes, deserts, and river valleys of Central Asia. The first seeds of exchange were sown in the late Neolithic and early Bronze Ages, when sedentary farming communities began to encounter nomadic herders along the outer edges of fertile valleys, such as those surrounding the Tarim Basin, the Yellow River, and the lands that would later comprise modern-day Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and western China. These encounters, often sporadic and cautious, marked humanity's earliest steps toward connecting distant cultures and resources, forging an intricate web of mutual dependence that would eventually mature into a structured network of trade. In the arid lands of the Tarim Basin, settlements such as the ancient city-states of Lulan and Kroran flourished around oases, sustained by the underground rivers that seeped through the surrounding desert sands. Archaeologists have unearthed mummified remains from this region, dating back more than 4,000 years, whose clothing, hairstyles, and even eye colors suggest a striking cultural diversity, hinting at interactions between Indo-European and East Asian peoples long before any formalized trade route existed. These early communities were linked not by roads paved in stone or patrolled by caravan guards, but by trails marked by the knowledge of water sources, grazing grounds, and the rhythms of seasonal winds. They exchanged basic commodities, grains, pastoral goods like horses and wool, and occasionally rarer items such as jade and turquoise. Meanwhile, to the east, in the lands of the Shang and early Zhou dynasties, China was beginning to develop the silken threads that would, centuries later, give the route its name. Silk production, known as sericulture, had already become a closely guarded state secret. The sericulture industry required both patience and skill. Silkworms fed exclusively on mulberry leaves, and the process of transforming their delicate cocoons into long, lustrous threads demanded exacting techniques. At this stage, silk was not yet a global commodity, but a regional luxury, worn by elites and used in ritual offerings. Yet its significance extended beyond mere ornamentation. Silk became a symbol of status, a medium of exchange, and a subtle instrument of diplomacy, even within the confines of Chinese borders. It would not remain confined for long. West of these early Chinese centers, the steppes and deserts of Central Asia were home to pastoral nomads, the precursors to later groups such as the Scythians and Sakas. These nomads were unparalleled in mobility, riding on horses that were themselves products of careful breeding and mastery of the steppe environment. Their mobility enabled them to traverse vast distances, linking disparate settlements and facilitating the flow of ideas, technologies, and goods. Horses, in particular, were highly prized commodities. Early Chinese chronicles from the Zhou period already note exchanges with Western barbarians for horses, sought for both their strength and speed. In a sense, the foundation of the Silk Road was laid not by merchants alone, but by the pastoralists, whose mastery of movement across the steppe created corridors of connectivity. By the first millennium BCE, long-distance trade began to assume more recognizable patterns. The sedentary kingdoms of Bactria, Sogdiana, and Parthia, located along the fertile fringes of the Iranian Plateau and the Oxus River, became vital nodes in this emerging network. These regions were rich in resources and strategically positioned as the crossroads of emerging empires. Archaeological evidence, including coins, ceramics, and luxury goods attests to extensive trade with both the Mediterranean world and the early Chinese dynasties. Bactria, for instance, became known not only for its fertile soil and agricultural output, but also as a center of artisan craftsmanship and a conduit for goods moving east and west. Sogdiana, slightly to the north, would later emerge as the quintessential Silk Road intermediary, its merchants becoming legendary for their skill in negotiation, language, and cross-cultural navigation. The technological advances of the era also played a critical role in preparing the stage for the Silk Road. The development of wheeled vehicles, improvements in horse breeding, and the establishment of fortified settlements allowed for safer and more predictable movement across previously perilous territories. Caravans could carry larger quantities of goods, while fortified outposts offered shelter and protection for both merchants and travelers. In these early centuries, however, travel remained dangerous. Banditry, harsh climates, and unpredictable water sources all posed existential threats. Those who ventured far from home had to be adept not only in trade, but in diplomacy, military readiness, and survival. Religion and cultural exchange were intertwined with these early economic interactions. The spread of Zoroastrianism across Persia, the cult of Mithra, and the development of early Buddhist practices in northwestern India exemplify how spiritual and ideological ideas often traveled along the same paths as commodities. The routes facilitated not only the movement of silk, jade, horses, and spices, but also stories, philosophies, and rituals, embedding a cultural dimension into what would eventually become a network synonymous with commerce. Monasteries, shrines, and temples sometimes arose at key waypoints, offering respite to travelers while acting as hubs of learning and record-keeping. By the 3rd century BCE, the political landscape of Eurasia began to consolidate in ways that further enabled trade. The rise of the Qin dynasty unified much of China, creating centralized infrastructure, codified laws, and standardized weights and measures, all essential for long-distance commerce. Roads connecting interior towns to frontier garrisons improved the efficiency of trade, while state control of salt, iron, and luxury goods, including silk, allowed for regulated export beyond China's borders. Simultaneously, to the west, the Persian Achaemenid Empire and its successors maintained expansive networks of satrapies and caravan routes, providing relative stability across vast territories that would prove essential for the movement of goods. It was in this crucible of technological innovation, political consolidation, and cultural curiosity that the Silk Road first took shape, not as a single, defined road, but as a network of interconnected trails linking East Asia, Central Asia, and the fringes of the Mediterranean. By the time of the early Han dynasty in the 2nd century BCE, these networks had matured enough to facilitate sustained, long-distance trade. Envoys, merchants, and adventurers moved with increasing frequency, carrying not only goods, but also intelligence about distant lands, peoples, and possibilities. Silk, once an insular luxury, was poised to become the emblem of cross-continental commerce. Yet, it is crucial to understand that the earliest phase of the Silk Road was not a tale of opulence or ease. The initial centuries were marked by incremental experimentation, local adaptations, and cautious negotiation with unfamiliar cultures. Geography dictated the flow of exchange more than any central authority, with deserts, mountains, and rivers serving as both conduits and barriers. Political fragmentation, nomadic incursions, and climatic fluctuations shaped the possibilities and limits of trade. Despite these challenges, The desire to reach beyond the familiar, to access rare resources, exotic goods, and distant knowledge, drove communities to push further into the unknown. Legends from this era survive in fragmentary accounts. Chinese chronicles recount emissaries sent westward in pursuit of alliances and horses, often returning with tales of vast deserts, formidable mountains, and peoples with customs utterly alien to those of the Middle Kingdom. Persian and Greco-Roman sources hint at the tantalizing presence of silk, spices, and precious stones arriving from lands beyond the horizon, carried by merchants whose origins were as mysterious as the goods they transported. While some stories are undoubtedly exaggerated or mythologized, they convey the awe and ambition that animated early exchanges along these emerging routes. By the close of the first millennium BCE, the Silk Road's embryonic pathways were firmly etched into the landscapes of Central Asia. Oasis towns, nomadic encampments, and emerging city-states formed nodes along a web that would only expand in the centuries to come. The exchange of goods, ideas, and culture had begun to accelerate, laying the foundation for one of history's most enduring networks of human interaction. The road ahead, both literal and symbolic, would stretch thousands of miles, carrying with it the aspirations, fears, and ingenuity of countless generations. In this earliest phase, the Silk Road was less a road than a vision, a tapestry of possibilities connecting peoples across deserts, steppes, and mountains, sewn together by curiosity, ambition, and necessity. It would be many decades before caravans bristling with silk, glass, and spices became the iconic image of the Silk Road, but the stage was now set. The ambitions of emperors, merchants, and nomads alike would soon converge to transform these tentative trails into a network whose influence would span continents and endure for over a millennium. With the dawn of the Han Dynasty in 206 BCE, China entered a period of unprecedented political consolidation, economic expansion, and cultural ambition. The founder, Emperor Gaozu, had emerged from the turmoil of the Qin collapse to unite the fragmented warring states under a central authority. Though his reign began cautiously, it laid the groundwork for a dynasty that would become synonymous with the formalization of the Silk Road. The Han rulers recognized early that China's wealth and stability depended not only on internal governance, but on securing the frontiers and fostering controlled exchanges with distant peoples. The westward expansion into the Tarim Basin, under military and diplomatic pressure, marked the first major strategic step in connecting China to Central Asia in a more systematic fashion. The impetus for this westward expansion was multifaceted. The Han Empire faced threats from nomadic confederations such as the Xiongnu, whose mobility, skill in mounted warfare, and knowledge of the steppe posed a constant challenge. The Xiongnu demanded tribute and occasionally raided Chinese territories, making it both a military and economic necessity for the Han to neutralize or appease them. The solution was a combination of diplomacy, trade, and military campaigns designed to establish tributary relations, secure alliances with smaller nomadic tribes, and gain access to the lands that would become the arteries of the Silk Road. This approach set a precedent. Economic exchange was inseparable from strategic territorial control, and the movement of goods required protection, negotiation, and careful planning. One of the most famous figures from this era, Zhang Qian, epitomizes the blend of diplomacy and exploration that shaped the early Silk Road. In 138 BCE, Zhang was sent on a mission by Emperor Wu to seek alliances with the Yuezhi, a nomadic group displaced by the Xiongnu in the regions of modern-day Central Asia. Zhang's journey, though fraught with danger, including capture by the Xiongnu and years of enforced residence among them, yielded remarkable intelligence about the peoples, cities, and trade networks of Central Asia. He reported on fertile valleys, oasis towns, and thriving communities in Bactria and beyond, and noted their demand for Chinese silk, a commodity that symbolized both luxury and statecraft. These reports would later form the basis of China's strategic and commercial engagements across the western frontier. The Han Dynasty's westward engagement spurred the development of a series of interconnected routes rather than a single, continuous road. The northern route followed the edges of the Gobi Desert, passing through oasis cities such as Dunhuang, Turfan, and Hami, where caravans could rest, resupply, and trade. The southern route, meanwhile, threaded through the mountainous passes of the Hexi corridor, linking to the fertile valleys of Central Asia. These routes were neither straight nor safe. Travelers faced harsh deserts, treacherous mountain paths, and extreme seasonal variations, yet the promise of lucrative trade, silk, spices, metals, and exotic goods, drove merchants and envoys to navigate these perilous passages repeatedly. The Chinese state recognized that protecting these routes was essential. Forts and garrisons were established, and local rulers were often incorporated into the tributary system, guaranteeing relative stability along these early trade corridors. Silk, at this stage, emerged as the central commodity defining China's outward trade. The Han Dynasty perfected techniques in sericulture, weaving, and dyeing, producing fabrics unmatched in quality and luxury. Silk was more than a commercial good. It was a tool of diplomacy. Emperors sent silk to neighboring kingdoms and distant tribes as gifts, tributes, and bribes. These gifts often secured military alliances, facilitated peace treaties, and cemented China's cultural prestige. The allure of silk quickly became legendary beyond China's borders, reaching as far as the Mediterranean through intermediaries in Central Asia, where merchants and nomads carried it westward in exchange for horses, precious stones, and metals. Equally important were the intermediary civilizations of Central Asia, whose merchants, city-states, and nomadic leaders became indispensable in linking China to the wider world. Sogdians, in particular, would emerge as master traders and cultural brokers. They spoke multiple languages, understood the complex customs of diverse societies, and navigated the dangerous desert and mountain routes with unparalleled skill. Cities such as Samarkand, Bactra, and Merv became thriving hubs of commerce, where Chinese silk, Indian spices, Persian silver, and Roman glass mingled in bustling marketplaces. These cities were not merely centers of trade, but also melting pots of cultural, religious, and technological exchange. Buddhist monks, Zoroastrian priests, and other itinerant scholars moved alongside merchants, bringing ideas, texts, and practices that would reshape the cultural landscapes of Central and East Asia. During this period, caravanserais, rest stops offering shelter, food, and protection, began to emerge along key routes. These way stations were often located near oases or river crossings, strategically placed to facilitate long journeys. They became microcosms of Silk Road civilization, where traders, soldiers, pilgrims, and travelers mingled, exchanged information, and forged alliances. Without such infrastructure, the vast distances and harsh environments would have rendered sustained long-distance trade impossible. The establishment of caravanserais demonstrated an early understanding that commerce was inseparable from organization, infrastructure, and security. The Han Dynasty also fostered maritime trade, though the overland Silk Road remained the dominant conduit for luxury goods. Chinese silk and ceramics began to appear in ports along the Indian Ocean and Persian Gulf, carried by ships to India, Persia, and beyond. This dual strategy, overland and maritime, reflected a sophisticated understanding of geography, logistics, and diplomacy. Trade was never a solitary endeavor. It relied on networks of intermediaries, alliances with local rulers, and knowledge of shifting political landscapes. Even as the overland routes flourished, the Han court remained acutely aware that the wealth and influence of China depended on maintaining control and oversight of these vital corridors. Religion and cultural exchange intensified along these routes. Early Buddhism, which had originated in India, began to travel north and east, reaching China through Central Asian intermediaries. Monks and scholars carried sacred texts, iconography, and teachings, sometimes in the same caravans as silk, horses, and other commodities. Temples and monasteries began to appear along key nodes of the trade routes, serving as both spiritual centers and cultural waypoints. These religious networks contributed to the Silk Road's identity as more than a channel for material wealth. It became a conduit for ideas, philosophies, and artistic traditions, linking civilizations across thousands of miles. Conflict and negotiation remained constants. The Xiongnu continued to pose challenges, and local rulers along the oasis towns and valleys often sought to assert their autonomy. The Han dynasty's approach combined military campaigns, strategic marriage alliances, and the selective use of tribute and trade to stabilize these regions. This blend of coercion and commerce created a relatively secure environment for long-distance exchange and set a model for later dynasties and empires, including the Tang and the Mongols, who would expand the network even further. By the 1st century BCE, the Silk Road was taking shape as a recognizable network, linking China's imperial heartlands to the flourishing civilizations of Central Asia. The flow of silk, horses, metals, and luxury goods had become more predictable, while cultural, religious, and technological exchanges began to leave enduring imprints across the regions. The Han dynasty's strategic vision, combined with the adaptability of nomads and the skill of merchants, had transformed what had once been a tentative network of trails into an operational artery of commerce, diplomacy, and cultural contact. This phase of the Silk Road was not yet a continuous highway, but a mosaic of interconnected paths, each requiring negotiation, skill, and courage to traverse. Yet the stage was set for further expansion. Over the coming centuries, the Silk Road would grow in complexity and reach, linking the Han dynasty's eastern domains with Persia, India, the Mediterranean, and even the distant Roman Empire. The ambitions, conflicts, and innovations of this period laid the foundation for a network that would shape Eurasian history for over a millennium. By the 1st century CE, the Silk Road had matured into a functioning network of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange, extending from the courts of Han China to the cities of the Roman Empire. While caravans continued to wind their way through the deserts and mountains of Central Asia, a new and ambitious phenomenon emerged: the direct flow of commodities between two of the ancient world's greatest powers. The Romans, with their appetite for luxury goods, and the Han, with their unrivaled production of silk, had entered an era of indirect dialogue mediated by merchants, nomads, and city-states strategically positioned along the overland routes. The Silk Road was no longer simply a Chinese enterprise. It had become a transcontinental conduit, linking east and west in a complex web of commerce and culture. Rome's fascination with silk is well documented in contemporary sources. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, marveled at the exotic fabric, describing its delicate texture and luminous sheen, while lamenting that vast sums of gold were leaving the empire to acquire this eastern luxury. Silk became a status symbol reserved for elites, senators, and imperial households. It was not merely a commodity, but a cultural signifier, a tangible connection to the distant mysterious lands of the Far East. Roman traders, eager to meet the demand of aristocratic consumers, relied heavily on intermediaries, as the direct overland journey across Central Asia was long, perilous, and politically complex. Central Asia remained the linchpin of this growing transcontinental commerce. The oasis towns of Sogdiana, most notably Samarkand, Bukhara, and Panjikent, functioned as critical junctions where goods from the east and west were exchanged, repackaged, and transported further along the routes. Sogdian merchants, with their mastery of languages, currencies, and customs, became indispensable facilitators of this trade. They navigated not only the physical challenges of deserts and mountains, but the intricate diplomatic terrain of multiple empires, city-states, and nomadic confederations. Their expertise ensured that silk from China, spices from India, and glassware from the Mediterranean reached the intended markets safely, while also enabling the diffusion of ideas, religious beliefs, and artistic styles. The maritime routes also began to complement overland trade during this period. Indian Ocean ports in southern India and along the Arabian Peninsula offered alternative pathways for goods, especially bulk items such as spices, ivory, and precious stones. Roman merchants, particularly from Egypt and the Levant, increasingly relied on these maritime corridors to acquire Eastern luxuries, while Chinese and Indian traders used the Red Sea and Persian Gulf routes to reach Western markets. Although these maritime networks were slower to develop than the overland routes, they would eventually become integral to the Silk Road's broader economic ecosystem. Religion and philosophy traveled alongside these tangible commodities carried by merchants and pilgrims alike. Buddhism, which had spread northward from India into the oasis towns of Central Asia, began to move east into China in earnest during this period. Monks and scholars carried sacred texts, images, and teachings, creating early monastic centers along the Silk Road. Likewise, Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and other religious ideas traveled westward, leaving traces in the art, architecture, and literature of the regions they touched. These exchanges enriched the spiritual and intellectual landscapes of Eurasia, forging connections that extended far beyond the material economy. The Roman-Han commercial connection was neither simple nor direct. Goods often passed through multiple hands, each layer adding value, profit, and occasionally distortion. Roman silver coins, for example, circulated widely in Central Asia, facilitating trade but also revealing the complex interdependencies between distant empires. Horses from Central Asia were highly prized in China, where they were essential for military campaigns against the Xiongnu and other nomadic tribes. These horses, often purchased with silk, became both tools of warfare and symbols of political ambition. The Silk Road, in this sense, was as much about power and strategy as it was about trade. Central Asia itself underwent profound transformation as a result of these interactions. Cities along the Silk Road flourished, attracting artisans, merchants, and scholars from diverse regions. Local economies became increasingly specialized, producing goods that could be traded long distances. Pottery, textiles, metalwork, and other crafts were exchanged alongside luxury items, fostering innovation and cross-cultural borrowing. The cosmopolitan character of these cities, as revealed by archaeological finds, shows a remarkable diversity of languages, religions, and artistic styles coexisting within relatively compact urban centers. These were not merely trading posts. They were vibrant cultural and economic hubs that shaped the character of Eurasian civilization. The Han dynasty's diplomatic and military strategy continued to play a crucial role in sustaining these connections. The establishment of protectorates along the Hexi corridor and the Tarim Basin, including cities such as Dunhuang and Kucha, ensured the security of trade routes while integrating local populations into China's sphere of influence. Military garrisons and administrative posts stabilized these regions, providing safe passage for merchants and travelers. The Han court recognized that commerce was inseparable from governance, and their proactive engagement in Central Asia exemplified a sophisticated understanding of geopolitics and economic strategy. Despite these achievements, the Silk Road remained fraught with danger. Banditry, harsh climates, and political instability could disrupt even well-organized caravans. The journey from China to the Roman Empire could take years, with goods passing through dozens of intermediaries, each subject to the vagaries of regional power struggles. Traders relied heavily on local guides, caravaneers, and nomadic escorts to navigate these treacherous conditions. The risk was immense, but so too were the potential rewards. The high value of silk, spices, and precious metals made the perilous journey worthwhile for those willing to endure it. The Roman engagement with the Silk Road also influenced Western perceptions of the East. Accounts by Roman geographers, historians, and travelers painted a picture of a distant, exotic land filled with riches and marvels. While many details were exaggerated or distorted, these narratives contributed to the enduring mystique of China and Central Asia in the Western imagination. Roman demand for luxury goods drove innovation in production and trade, reinforcing the interdependence between empires separated by thousands of miles, but connected through the complex machinery of the Silk Road. By the 2nd century CE, the Silk Road had achieved a degree of regularity and predictability that earlier generations could scarcely have imagined. Caravans followed established routes, oasis towns functioned as hubs of commerce and culture, and the exchange of goods, ideas, and religions had become a defining feature of Eurasian life. The Han-Roman connection demonstrated the potential of the Silk Road, not merely as a conduit for material wealth, but as a network capable of linking civilizations across vast distances. Yet this period also revealed the fragility inherent in such a vast system. Political instability, shifts in imperial power, and the ever-present threat of nomadic incursions could disrupt trade at any moment. The Silk Road, for all its promise, required constant maintenance, negotiation, and adaptation. The interweaving of commerce, diplomacy, and culture, however, ensured that these routes would endure, evolving to meet the challenges of each new century. The Roman and Han empires, though separated by deserts and mountains, had inaugurated an era in which East and West were connected in ways that would shape the course of history for generations to come. By linking the Far East to the Mediterranean, the Silk Road had begun to transform the world into a more interconnected place. Goods flowed, ideas spread, and cultures encountered one another in ways unprecedented in human history. It was a network defined not merely by geography, but by the ambitions, ingenuity, and courage of the people who traversed it. The stage was now set for further expansion, as new powers would rise to dominate, protect, and exploit the routes in the centuries to follow, carrying the Silk Road into its next golden era. As the 1st and 2nd centuries CE unfolded, the vast landscapes of Central Asia became the vital bridge linking China and the Mediterranean world. It was here that the Silk Road, still a network of trails rather than a singular highway, was consolidated and structured through the efforts of local powers who understood the value of commerce. Among these, the Parthian Empire and the Kushan dynasty emerged as crucial intermediaries, shaping the flow of goods, people, and ideas across the heart of Eurasia. Their political and economic influence would prove decisive in the evolution of the Silk Road, ensuring that it became more than a collection of isolated paths, but a functioning transcontinental network with hubs, checkpoints, and protected corridors. The Parthians, ruling much of what is now Iran and Iraq from approximately 247 BCE to 224 CE, controlled a strategic corridor connecting the Mediterranean world to Central Asia. They inherited the infrastructure and trade practices of the earlier Achaemenid Empire, maintaining caravan routes and urban centers that had long facilitated east-west exchange. Parthian cities like Ctesiphon and Hekatompelos became vital nodes for merchants traveling between Rome and China, offering both protection and markets for goods. The Parthians were renowned for their ability to mediate between empires, managing diplomatic and commercial relations with Rome, the Kushans, and various Central Asian nomadic groups. Their expertise in political negotiation and military deterrence allowed trade to flourish under their watch, though it remained dependent on the shifting dynamics of regional power. To the northeast, the Kushans consolidated control over much of Bactria, Sogdiana, and northern India, creating a transregional empire ideally positioned along the Silk Road's central arteries. Emerging in the 1st century CE, the Kushan dynasty benefited from both the remnants of Hellenistic influence in Bactria and the growing economic importance of India as a source of spices, gemstones, and textiles. The Kushans recognized the wealth to be gained from controlling trade, establishing cities and markets that facilitated the exchange of Chinese silk, Mediterranean glassware, Indian spices, and Central Asian horses. The Kushan rulers often minted coins bearing images familiar to multiple cultures, reflecting their multi-ethnic empire and signaling a deliberate effort to appeal to the diverse traders and populations who passed through their territories. Oasis towns along the Silk Road flourished under this system. Cities such as Samarkand, Merv, and Termez became not only commercial centers, but also cultural crossroads. Archaeological evidence reveals the remarkable cosmopolitanism of these settlements. Temples dedicated to Zoroastrian, Buddhist, and Hellenistic deities coexist, alongside inscriptions in multiple languages, including Greek, Sanskrit, and Sogdian. Merchants from distant lands congregated in these cities, exchanging not only goods, but also knowledge, technologies, and religious ideas. These hubs functioned as early cosmopolitan urban centers, bridging not only East and West, but also the diverse cultures of Central Asia itself. The Kushans, in particular, played a pivotal role in the spread of Buddhism. As Chinese and Central Asian monks traveled along the Silk Road, they encountered Kushan cities and monasteries, which became vital waypoints for religious and cultural transmission. Gandharan art, blending Hellenistic and Indian styles, spread along these routes, influencing both Chinese Buddhist iconography and Central Asian artistic traditions. This period illustrates the dual nature of the Silk Road. It was as much a conduit for spiritual and intellectual exchange as it was for commerce. Temples, shrines, and monasteries often grew alongside caravan routes, providing shelter, education, and hospitality to travelers and merchants, thereby reinforcing the Silk Road's role as a connective tissue of civilizations. Trade under the Parthians and Kushans involved intricate systems of credit, exchange, and protection. Caravan merchants relied on networks of local guides, guards, and oasis-based intermediaries to transport goods safely across deserts and mountains. Wealthy merchants often formed syndicates to pool resources and share risk, while local rulers levied taxes and duties in return for security and access. This sophisticated infrastructure allowed luxury goods such as silk, jade, spices, glassware, and precious metals to traverse thousands of kilometers, often passing through numerous hands before reaching their final markets. The profitability of this trade created a powerful incentive for states to maintain stability along the routes, incentivizing diplomacy and sometimes military intervention. The role of nomadic groups in this period was equally significant. While earlier Xiongnu confederations posed threats to the Han dynasty, new nomadic powers emerged along the steppe, including the Yuezhi and later the Hephthalites. These nomadic groups often acted as both protectors and disruptors of trade. Some served as caravan escorts, controlling key passages across deserts and mountain ranges, while others exploited the wealth moving through the region by raiding or demanding tribute. Merchants learned to negotiate with these groups, offering gifts, bribes, or trade concessions to secure safe passage. The interplay between sedentary empires and mobile nomads defined much of the Silk Road's early operational logic. Meanwhile, the Roman Empire's demand for Eastern luxuries continued to grow. Roman merchants and intermediaries relied heavily on Parthian and Kushan networks to access Chinese silk, a commodity so coveted that it inspired legends and speculation about the East. Roman coins and luxury goods appear in Central Asia and even northern India, evidence of a thriving and increasingly sophisticated exchange network. At the same time, Chinese records from the Han dynasty, including the accounts of travelers and envoys, indicate awareness of distant empires, though understanding remained incomplete. The Silk Road thus became a network of perception as well as commerce, shaping how cultures imagined and interacted with one another across immense distances. Political and military events during this period had direct consequences for trade. Shifts in leadership, wars between regional powers, and the rise or fall of dynasties could enhance or disrupt the flow of goods. For example, the decline of Parthian authority in the early 3rd century CE allowed the Sasanian Empire to consolidate control over Persia, introducing new administrative practices and security measures that would influence Silk Road commerce. Similarly, fluctuations in Kushan power altered access to Indian spices and textiles, creating both challenges and opportunities for merchants. Traders adapted by altering routes, forming new alliances, and employing increasingly sophisticated methods of negotiation and protection. Technological and logistical innovations also advanced during this era. The development of improved caravan saddles, pack animals, and navigational knowledge allowed caravans to carry heavier loads more efficiently. Roads and way stations were maintained with greater attention, often under the supervision of local rulers who understood the economic value of trade. Such innovations reduced some of the risks inherent in long-distance travel, though hazards remained ever present. Desert crossings, mountain passes, and political borders continued to challenge even the most experienced merchants. Cultural exchange during this period intensified alongside commerce. The movement of artisans, scholars, and religious figures facilitated the spread of artistic styles, scientific knowledge, and philosophical ideas. For example, Buddhist motifs influenced Central Asian art, which in turn shaped Chinese Buddhist iconography. Similarly, Hellenistic artistic techniques survived in Bactria and were adapted to local traditions, creating a unique synthesis visible in sculpture, coinage, and architecture. The Silk Road was thus not merely a physical network, but an intellectual and cultural highway, transmitting knowledge as readily as it did silk or spices. By the end of the 2nd century CE, the Silk Road had transformed Central Asia into a highly interconnected, economically vibrant, and culturally diverse region. The Parthians and Kushans had established political and economic frameworks that facilitated long-distance trade while managing the complexities of nomadic mobility and local autonomy. Cities thrived as nodes of commerce and culture, Monasteries proliferated, and ideas circulated alongside goods. The Silk Road had evolved from a collection of tentative paths into a functioning system capable of sustaining transcontinental exchange. Yet this consolidation came with challenges: political instability, nomadic incursions, and the sheer logistical complexity of transporting goods across thousands of kilometers meant that the Silk Road was always vulnerable to disruption. Nevertheless, the networks established by the Parthians and Kushans provided a template for future empires, demonstrating the possibilities of controlled trade, infrastructure, and cultural diplomacy. The stage was set for the next era, the flourishing of the Silk Road under the Tang dynasty, when commerce, culture, and imperial ambition would converge to create its most celebrated golden age. The advent of the Tang dynasty in 618 CE marked a transformative period for the Silk Road, elevating it from a network of trade routes into a thriving artery of commerce, culture, and diplomacy. The Tang rulers, inheriting the legacies of the Han dynasty, understood the strategic, economic, and ideological significance of connecting China with distant lands. Unlike earlier eras, the Tang dynasty approached the Silk Road not merely as a means to export silk or secure alliances, but as a grand instrument for projecting imperial power, fostering cultural prestige, and integrating a vast and diverse empire into the broader world system. The period that followed would come to be regarded as the Silk Road's golden age, when overland and maritime routes flourished in unprecedented prosperity. The political stability established by the Tang emperors was central to this flourishing. With a strong central bureaucracy, codified laws, and a professional military, the dynasty ensured both internal cohesion and external security along critical trade corridors. The Hexi Corridor, linking the Chinese heartland with the western regions, became a heavily policed and administered thoroughfare. Frontier garrisons and fortified cities like Dunhuang, Kucha, and Turfan protected merchants from bandits and hostile nomads, while also serving as administrative outposts where taxes, tolls, and diplomatic interactions were managed. The Tang state recognized that the wealth of the empire was inseparable from the safe movement of goods, and it invested heavily in maintaining the infrastructure that allowed trade to thrive. Tang China's appetite for foreign goods was immense, and the empire became a magnet for traders, artisans, and emissaries from across Eurasia. Silk remained the most prized commodity, flowing westward in vast quantities, but it was accompanied by paper, porcelain, tea, and lacquerware. In return, Chinese markets welcomed precious stones, spices, precious metals, and horses from Central Asia, India, and beyond. The introduction of paper, invented during the Han dynasty, had a particularly profound impact, enabling bureaucratic efficiency and literacy to spread rapidly, while also becoming an item of trade itself. Knowledge, much like goods, became a commodity transmitted along these networks. The Tang dynasty also saw a remarkable expansion of cultural exchange. Buddhism, which had gradually moved eastward from India via Central Asia, reached a pinnacle of influence during this period. Monks, pilgrims, and scholars traveled along the Silk Road, establishing monasteries and temples that became centers of learning and artistic production. Buddhist iconography evolved through exposure to diverse artistic traditions, blending Indian, Persian, and Central Asian elements into styles that would profoundly influence Chinese art. Dunhuang's Mogao caves, for instance, stand as enduring testaments to this synthesis, with thousands of murals and manuscripts illustrating the cosmopolitan vibrancy of Silk Road cities. Central Asia itself became more deeply integrated into the Silk Road network under Tang influence. The western regions, or Xiu, encompassing the Tarim Basin and surrounding territories, were brought under nominal Chinese control through a combination of military campaigns and diplomatic alliances. Local rulers were incorporated into the Tang tributary system, and protectorates were established to secure trade routes. These policies facilitated relatively safe passage for caravans and ensured that Chinese and foreign merchants could navigate the deserts and oases with greater predictability than in previous centuries. At the same time, the Tang engaged diplomatically with distant empires, including Persia and the Byzantine Empire, extending the reach of the Silk Road far beyond the boundaries of China itself. Trade along the Silk Road during the Tang period was diverse and sophisticated. Sogdian merchants, who had long been central intermediaries, reached the height of their influence, operating trading houses in major Chinese cities such as Chang'an, the Tang capital. These merchants were multilingual, highly organized, and adept at navigating the legal and political frameworks of multiple states. They facilitated the movement of goods, provided banking and credit services, and acted as cultural intermediaries. Through their efforts, Chinese silk reached Persia, Central Asia, and even the Mediterranean, while Roman glass, Indian spices, and Central Asian gems found their way to the markets of Chang'an. The Sogdians' expertise illustrates how trade networks relied not only on geography and infrastructure, but also on human skill, diplomacy, and cultural knowledge. Maritime trade routes complemented overland commerce during this period. The rise of Tang maritime expeditions expanded China's connections to Southeast Asia, India, and the Persian Gulf. Ports such as Guangzhou, Guangzhou, and Yangzhou became bustling centers of foreign trade, linking the Indian Ocean economy to the overland Silk Road. Maritime routes allowed for bulk goods such as spices, timber, and ceramics to travel efficiently over long distances, while overland routes continued to carry high-value, low-bulk commodities like silk, jade, and precious metals. The dual network of land and sea trade reflected Tang China's sophisticated understanding of logistics, geography, and commerce. Cultural interchange was not limited to religion or art. It extended to science, medicine, and technology. Astronomical knowledge, medical practices, and metallurgical techniques moved along the Silk Road, enriching civilizations across Eurasia. Tang China absorbed influences from Persia, India, and Central Asia, while simultaneously exporting its innovations. This exchange of knowledge facilitated advancements in cartography, mathematics, medicine, and engineering, underscoring the Silk Road's role as a vector not just for material wealth, but for intellectual and technological transformation. The cosmopolitan nature of Tang cities reflects the diversity of the Silk Road's human geography. In Chang'an, the imperial capital, residents included Persians, Sogdians, Arabs, Indians, Koreans, and Japanese, each contributing to the vibrant social and commercial fabric of the city. Markets thrived with goods from every corner of Eurasia, while festivals, music, and artistic performances blended multiple cultural traditions. The city itself became a microcosm of the Silk Road, demonstrating the ways in which trade, migration, and cultural exchange reshaped urban life. The Tang dynasty also relied on diplomacy to secure the Silk Road's continued prosperity. Envoys traveled to the Abbasid Caliphate, the Byzantine Empire, and Indian kingdoms, exchanging gifts, negotiating treaties, and cultivating political alliances. These diplomatic efforts often reinforced commercial ties, ensuring that merchants could operate under predictable conditions and that goods, could flow with minimal interruption. At the same time, the Tang court exercised control over its frontiers, deploying military forces when necessary to quell unrest or defend against nomadic incursions. The combination of diplomacy, military oversight, and economic incentive created one of the most stable periods in Silk Road history. Despite these achievements, the Silk Road was not immune to challenges. Natural hazards, such as desert storms, mountain passes, and river crossings, continued to threaten caravans. Banditry and regional conflict occasionally disrupted trade, and the logistical demands of coordinating long-distance commerce remained immense. Nevertheless, the Tang dynasty's policies, infrastructure, and cosmopolitan approach ensured that these obstacles were managed effectively, allowing commerce and cultural exchange to flourish at an unprecedented scale. By the mid-8th century, the Silk Road under the Tang dynasty had achieved a level of sophistication and reach unmatched in earlier eras. Luxury goods, religious ideas, artistic traditions, and scientific knowledge flowed with remarkable regularity across the network. Central Asia had become a bridge connecting East and West, while Chinese cities thrived as hubs of trade and culture. The legacy of this period was profound. The Silk Road had evolved into a golden artery of human civilization, shaping economies, religions, and cultures across Eurasia. Yet the Tang dynasty's golden age also sowed the seeds of future challenges. Political overreach, internal rebellion, and the pressures of maintaining far-flung protectorates would eventually strain the empire. While the Silk Road reached unparalleled heights of prosperity and cultural richness, the delicate balance of commerce, diplomacy, and military oversight remained vulnerable to disruption. The story of the Silk Road's triumphs under the Tang dynasty would soon be tested by the upheavals of later centuries, as new powers, shifting alliances, and the relentless movement of peoples reshaped the networks that had come to define Eurasian civilization. By the late 8th century, the Tang dynasty's golden age began to waver, and with it, the Silk Road faced significant transformations. Internal unrest, regional fragmentation, and pressures from nomadic incursions disrupted the stability that had allowed trade and cultural exchange to flourish. While the dynasty maintained its formal authority, the central government's ability to directly control the farthest reaches of the western frontier weakened. The Hexi corridor, the Tarim Basin, and the oasis cities that had long served as the backbone of overland trade increasingly fell under the influence of local rulers, military governors, and emerging regional powers. The Silk Road endured, but its character shifted from a centrally managed imperial network to a mosaic of semi-autonomous trade corridors, each shaped by the ambitions and capacities of regional authorities. The An Lushan Rebellion, beginning in 755 CE, marked a turning point in Tang history. This devastating civil war ravaged northern China, destabilizing the political and economic systems that supported long-distance trade. Agricultural production collapsed in many regions, taxation systems faltered, and the imperial court struggled to maintain control over distant provinces. Although the rebellion was eventually suppressed, its consequences reverberated for decades. The Tang military, stretched thin by internal conflicts, could no longer guarantee safe passage along the Silk Road's most vulnerable stretches. Oasis towns and frontier garrisons faced increasing threats from both bandits and opportunistic nomadic groups, and merchants had to adapt by seeking alternative routes or paying higher tolls and tribute to local powers. Amid this instability, regional powers in Central Asia rose to prominence, asserting control over key nodes of commerce. In the Tarim Basin, cities like Kucha, Turfan, and Kashgar navigated shifting allegiances between Tang authorities, Tibetan forces, and local kingdoms. These urban centers became quasi-independent, regulating trade, maintaining security, and negotiating with neighboring states to protect their commercial interests. Sogdian merchants, whose influence had already been substantial during the Tang Golden Age, became even more critical in this decentralized system, acting as intermediaries not only between East and West, but also among the competing regional authorities themselves. Their skill in diplomacy and trade ensured that, despite fragmentation, the flow of goods and ideas continued, albeit under more precarious circumstances. The Tibetan Empire emerged as a major player during this period, exerting control over vast portions of the Silk Road. Tibet's military campaigns in the 8th century brought large sections of the Hexi Corridor and the Tarim Basin under their influence. Tibetan rulers established administrative centers, collected tribute, and monitored the movement of caravans through the region. Their presence introduced new cultural and religious influences, including Tibetan Buddhism, which mingled with the Chinese, Indian, and Central Asian Buddhist traditions already present along the trade routes. While their control sometimes disrupted the flow of Chinese silk westward, it also integrated previously peripheral regions into broader networks of exchange. The Arab conquests and the rise of the Abbasid Caliphate further reshaped the western reaches of the Silk Road. By the mid-8th century, the Abbasids controlled Persia, Mesopotamia, and significant portions of Central Asia, establishing cities such as Baghdad as major commercial and intellectual centers. The Abbasid rulers actively encouraged trade, supporting caravan routes that linked the Islamic world with China, India, and the Mediterranean. Goods from the East, silk, spices, and porcelain flowed into Abbasid markets, while Western textiles, glass, and precious metals traveled eastward. The Abbasid period illustrates the increasingly multipolar nature of the Silk Road. No single empire dominated, but a network of regional powers collaborated, competed, and negotiated to sustain commerce across vast distances. Technological innovation continued even amidst political fragmentation. Caravan organization became more sophisticated, with merchants employing detailed planning to mitigate risk. Guides familiar with desert and mountain terrain were essential, as were armed escorts to protect against banditry. Markets and way stations were fortified by local authorities, and the system of credit and exchange expanded to include letters of credit, promissory notes, and other financial instruments. These innovations allowed the Silk Road to function despite the political turbulence of the period, demonstrating the adaptability of both merchants and local powers. Religious and cultural exchange remained remarkably resilient. Buddhist monasteries continued to flourish in the Tarim Basin and Central Asia, serving both spiritual and commercial functions. Nestorian Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Manichaeism spread along the trade routes, often finding fertile ground in cities where diverse populations intersected. The transmission of texts, artistic styles, and scientific knowledge persisted, illustrating that the Silk Road's role as a conduit of ideas was less dependent on centralized imperial control than previously assumed. Cultural hybridity became a defining characteristic of this period, as local rulers, merchants, and religious communities navigated the complex landscape of fragmented authority. Despite these continuities, certain challenges intensified. Desertification and shifting river courses affected the viability of traditional caravan routes, forcing traders to adapt their paths and strategies. Competition among local powers sometimes resulted in tolls, taxes, and extortion, increasing the cost of long-distance trade. The Tang court, though still influential, could exercise only limited oversight in the western regions. These factors introduced a new dimension of uncertainty. Trade continued, but it required constant negotiation, intelligence, and adaptation to survive. The decline of Tang power also had geopolitical consequences beyond China. The weakening of a central authority allowed nomadic confederations, such as the Uyghurs and later the Kyrgyz, to exert influence over parts of the Silk Road. These groups often acted as both protectors and exploiters of trade, controlling key mountain passes and desert corridors. Merchants learned to navigate these complex political landscapes through diplomacy, gift-giving, and strategic alliances, highlighting the increasingly intricate human networks that sustained commerce. Meanwhile, the Abbasid Empire and other emerging powers in the West were cultivating their own commercial sophistication. Cities along the Persian Plateau, the Oxus River, and the Caspian Sea became centers of exchange where Chinese silk, Indian spices, and Mediterranean glass converged. The Abbasids' promotion of scholarship, including the translation of Greek, Indian, and Persian texts, further cemented the Silk Road's role as a conduit for knowledge. Scientific, mathematical, and philosophical ideas circulated alongside material goods, enriching civilizations across Eurasia despite political fragmentation in the East. By the early 9th century, the Silk Road had evolved into a decentralized but resilient network. While the Tang dynasty's central authority waned, regional powers, nomadic groups, and merchant communities ensured that trade, cultural exchange, and religious transmission continued. Oasis cities acted as self-governing hubs, managing security, taxation, and commerce independently. The interplay of local initiative and imperial oversight created a system capable of adapting to political upheaval, environmental challenges, and shifting alliances. The period of Tang fragmentation illustrates a critical lesson in the history of the Silk Road. Its endurance depended not solely on imperial patronage, but on the skill, negotiation, and adaptability of the people who traversed it. Merchants, intermediaries, nomads, and local rulers formed a network of interdependent relationships that allowed goods, ideas, and religions to flow even when centralized authority faltered. The Silk Road's vitality was, in essence, a human achievement, maintained by generations of individuals who understood the rewards and the perils of connecting distant worlds. By the end of this era, the Silk Road had weathered the decline of the Tang dynasty, the rise of regional powers, and the incursions of nomadic confederations. Its structure had changed, becoming more decentralized and adaptive, but its core functions remained intact. Goods continued to move from China to the Mediterranean, ideas traveled along the routes, and cities along the way flourished as hubs of commerce and culture. The network that had begun as a series of tentative trails in the Han Dynasty had now matured into a robust, complex system capable of surviving political turbulence, environmental challenges, and the uncertainties of human ambition. From the 9th to the 11th centuries, the Silk Road entered a new phase, shaped by the rise of Islamic civilization and the gradual reorientation of Eurasian trade. As Tang authority faded in China and regional powers asserted themselves in Central Asia, the Islamic world emerged as the most dynamic and interconnected economic and intellectual zone across the western half of the Silk Road, stretching from Al-Andalus in Iberia to the borders of India and Central Asia. The Islamic caliphates provided political stability, legal frameworks, and commercial infrastructure that revitalized long-distance trade. The Silk Road did not disappear in this era. Rather, it adapted, pivoting toward new centers of gravity that reshaped its routes, rhythms, and cultural exchanges. The Abbasid Caliphate, founded in 750 CE with its capital at Baghdad, became the principal western anchor of Silk Road commerce. Baghdad was deliberately positioned near the Tigris River, linking overland caravan routes with riverine and maritime networks that reached the Persian Gulf and Indian Ocean. Merchants from Central Asia, Persia, India, and the Mediterranean converged in its markets, exchanging silk, spices, precious metals, paper, and manuscripts. The Abbasids actively promoted trade, recognizing it as both a source of wealth and a means of cultural prestige. Islamic law, with its protections for contracts, partnerships, and property, provided merchants with a predictable legal environment that encouraged investment and long-distance exchange. Central Asian cities flourished under Islamic rule and patronage. Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, and Balkh became major commercial and intellectual centers, each hosting vibrant markets and attracting scholars, artisans, and traders. These cities sat astride critical Silk Road corridors, linking China and the steppes with Persia and the Middle East. Samarkand, in particular, became renowned not only for its trade, but for its production of paper, a technology transmitted westward from China after the Battle of Talas in 751 CE. The spread of paper transformed administration, scholarship, and commerce throughout the Islamic world, enabling the rapid dissemination of knowledge and the efficient management of trade networks. While China experienced political fragmentation during the late Tang and Five Dynasties periods, trade with the Islamic world continued through both overland and maritime routes. Muslim merchants established communities in Chinese port cities such as Guangzhou and Quanzhou, where they traded spices, pearls, and aromatics for silk, porcelain, and tea. These maritime connections increasingly complemented, and in some cases rivaled, the overland Silk Road, especially for bulk goods. Nevertheless, the land routes remained essential for high-value items and for linking the heart of Eurasia, where maritime access was limited. Religion played a central role in shaping this era of the Silk Road. Islam spread steadily across Central Asia, often through the same merchant networks that carried goods. Traders, scholars, and missionaries introduced Islamic beliefs, practices, and institutions to cities and oasis towns along the routes. Mosques, madrasas, and caravanserais emerged side by side, integrating spiritual life with commercial activity. This process was gradual and complex, coexisting with older religious traditions such as Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, and Christianity. In many regions, these faiths interacted, competed, and influenced one another, creating layered religious landscapes that reflected the Silk Road's diversity. The Islamic Golden Age was also defined by the movement of ideas. Scholars in Baghdad, Bukhara, and Cordoba translated and synthesized knowledge from Greek, Persian, Indian, and Central Asian sources. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy flourished in this environment of cross-cultural exchange. The Silk Road facilitated this intellectual circulation, enabling texts, instruments, and scholars to travel vast distances. Chinese technologies such as papermaking and certain metallurgical techniques entered the Islamic world, while Islamic advances in mathematics and medicine would later influence Europe. The Silk Road thus functioned as an intellectual artery, transmitting knowledge across civilizations and centuries. Nomadic groups continued to shape the Silk Road during this period, particularly the Turkic peoples who dominated much of the Central Asian steppe. These groups controlled key passages and grazing lands, often serving as protectors or facilitators of trade. Many Turkic elites converted to Islam, integrating steppe societies more closely into the Islamic commercial and cultural sphere. Their mobility and military strength allowed them to influence trade routes, while their adoption of Islamic institutions facilitated cooperation with sedentary urban centers. The interaction between nomadic and settled societies remained a defining feature of Silk Road dynamics. Economically, the Silk Road during this era was characterized by increasing specialization and financial sophistication. Merchants used letters of credit, bills of exchange, and partnership agreements to manage risk and capital across long distances. Islamic banking practices enabled traders to operate without transporting large quantities of coinage, reducing vulnerability to theft and loss. These financial innovations made long-distance trade more efficient and resilient, allowing the Silk Road to function even amid political fragmentation or regional conflict. China's role in this period was less centralized but still significant. Under the Song dynasty, which emerged in the 10th century, China experienced economic growth, technological innovation, and urban expansion. Although the Song lacked the military reach of the Tang, they actively participated in global trade, particularly through maritime routes. Silk, porcelain, and tea continued to flow westward, while China imported horses, precious metals, and luxury goods. Overland trade through Central Asia persisted, though it increasingly relied on intermediaries and regional powers rather than direct imperial control. Environmental and logistical challenges continued to shape the Silk Road's evolution. Shifting river courses, desert expansion, and changing climate patterns affected traditional routes, prompting merchants to adapt their paths. Some oasis towns declined, while others rose in prominence based on access to water and political stability. The Silk Road was never static. It was a living system that responded constantly to environmental, political, and economic pressures. By the 11th century, the Silk Road had been transformed by the ascendancy of the Islamic world. Trade routes were more interconnected than ever, linking China, Central Asia, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean through a combination of overland and maritime networks. The exchange of goods was matched by the circulation of ideas, technologies, and beliefs, creating a shared Eurasian cultural sphere that transcended political boundaries. Although the centers of power had shifted, the Silk Road remained a vital mechanism of global interaction. This era demonstrates that the Silk Road's strength lay in its adaptability. As empires rose and fell, new civilizations stepped into the roles of patrons, intermediaries, and innovators. The Islamic Golden Age did not replace the Silk Road. It redefined it, integrating older routes into a broader, more interconnected world system. The foundations laid during this period would prove crucial for the next great transformation, when a new force from the Eurasian steppe would unite much of the Silk Road under a single political authority, reshaping its destiny once again. In the early 13th century, the Silk Road entered its most dramatic and transformative phase, forged not by merchants or monks, but by conquest. From the windswept steppes of Mongolia arose a force that would redraw the political map of Eurasia and reshape the Silk Road more profoundly than any empire before it. Under the leadership of Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongol Empire expanded with unprecedented speed, uniting vast territories from East Asia to Eastern Europe under a single, if often brutal, authority. For the Silk Road, this unification marked a paradoxical era of destruction and renewal, in which cities fell, populations suffered, yet long-distance trade reached levels of integration and security unmatched in earlier centuries. The Mongol conquests began in earnest around 1206, when Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, ruler of all Mongols. Drawing on steppe traditions of mobility, discipline, and loyalty, the Mongol armies swept across Central Asia, Persia, and northern China. Cities that resisted were often annihilated, serving as grim warnings to others. Yet once conquest was complete, the Mongols proved pragmatic administrators. They understood the value of commerce and communication across their empire, and they recognized the Silk Road as a source of wealth, intelligence, and legitimacy. Rather than dismantling existing trade networks, they sought to control and enhance them. Under Mongol rule, much of the Silk Road came under a single political framework for the first time in history. From the Yuan dynasty in China to the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Golden Horde in the western steppes, Mongol successor states maintained a shared interest in facilitating trade. Borders that had once required complex negotiations and tribute payments were simplified, allowing caravans to move with fewer interruptions. The Mongols established systems of passports and relay stations known as the yam, which provided fresh horses, food, and shelter for messengers and travelers. These innovations dramatically reduced travel times and improved the reliability of long-distance communication. Security along the Silk Road improved significantly during this period, a phenomenon later described as the Pax Mongolica. Banditry declined as Mongol patrols enforced order across key routes. Merchants, artisans, and envoys traveled with a degree of safety unknown in earlier eras, despite the vast distances involved. This stability encouraged an unprecedented flow of goods. Chinese silk and porcelain moved westward in large quantities, while Persian textiles, Central Asian horses, Indian spices, and European silver traveled east. The Silk Road became a truly imperial artery, serving the economic needs of a continent-spanning empire. The Mongols were notably tolerant of religions, a policy that further facilitated exchange. Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and practitioners of other faiths were allowed to worship freely, and religious leaders often received patronage. This tolerance encouraged scholars and missionaries to travel across the empire, spreading ideas and knowledge alongside goods. Buddhist monks journeyed from China to Central Asia. Muslim scholars traveled east to serve in Mongol courts, and Christian missionaries ventured deeper into Asia than ever before. The Silk Road thus became a conduit not only for trade, but for an extraordinary mingling of intellectual and spiritual traditions. European engagement with the Silk Road expanded dramatically during the Mongol era. Merchants from Italian city-states such as Venice and Genoa gained access to Central Asian and even Chinese markets through Mongol-controlled territories. The most famous of these travelers, Marco Polo, journeyed to the court of Kublai Khan in the late 13th century, spending years in service to the Yuan dynasty. His later account, though embellished, offered Europeans an unprecedented glimpse into the wealth, organization, and complexity of East Asia. These narratives fueled European curiosity and ambition, planting seeds that would later contribute to the age of exploration. Technological and scientific exchange accelerated under Mongol rule. Gunpowder technology, developed in China, spread westward, eventually transforming warfare in the Islamic world and Europe. Papermaking, already present in the Islamic world, expanded further, supporting bureaucratic governance and scholarship. Medical knowledge, astronomical observations, and cartographic techniques circulated widely, carried by scholars and artisans moving under Mongol patronage. The Silk Road became a vast laboratory of cross-cultural innovation, where practical knowledge was valued alongside luxury goods. Yet this era of integration came at a profound human cost. The Mongol conquests devastated many urban centers, particularly in Central Asia and Persia, where cities like Merv and Nishapur suffered catastrophic destruction. Agricultural systems were disrupted, populations displaced, and entire regions depopulated. While trade eventually revived, it did so atop landscapes scarred by violence. The prosperity of the Silk Road during this period was inseparable from the coercive power that sustained Mongol rule, a reminder that stability was often achieved through fear as much as cooperation. The Mongol Empire's vast scale also carried inherent vulnerabilities. Governing territories that stretched thousands of kilometers proved increasingly difficult as generations passed. Internal rivalries, succession disputes, and cultural differences gradually weakened centralized authority. By the mid-14th century, the empire fractured into independent khanates, each pursuing its own interests. While trade continued, the seamless integration of the Silk Road began to unravel as political unity gave way to regional competition. The spread of disease marked one of the most devastating consequences of this unprecedented connectivity. The Black Death, which emerged in Central Asia in the mid-14th century, traveled along Silk Road routes to the Middle East and Europe. Carried by fleas and rodents accompanying caravans and ships, the plague killed millions, reshaping societies and economies across Eurasia. This catastrophe underscored the double-edged nature of the Silk Road. The same networks that enabled prosperity and exchange also facilitated the rapid transmission of disaster. By the late 14th century, the Pax Mongolica had ended. The collapse of Mongol unity, combined with demographic decline from plague and renewed political fragmentation, weakened overland trade. Many Silk Road cities entered periods of stagnation or decline, and merchants increasingly turned to maritime routes as safer and more profitable alternatives. Nevertheless, the Mongol era left an enduring legacy. It demonstrated the Silk Road's full potential as a continent-spanning system of exchange capable of linking civilizations more tightly than ever before. The Mongol unification represented both the apex and the beginning of the end for the classical Silk Road. Never again would so much of Eurasia fall under a single political authority committed to maintaining overland connectivity. Yet the memories of this era, of merchants traveling safely across empires, of ideas flowing freely between cultures, and of a world briefly bound together, would shape how future generations imagined global connection. The Silk Road, transformed by conquest and cooperation alike, now stood at a crossroads, poised to yield its central role to new routes and new oceans. By the 15th century, the overland Silk Road that had thrived under Mongol authority was facing profound challenges. Political fragmentation, environmental pressures, and the rise of new maritime technologies reshaped the geography of trade, redirecting the flow of goods, ideas, and wealth toward the seas. The overland network remained active, but no longer held the primacy it had during the Tang or Mongol eras. Caravan cities that once bustled with merchants began to decline. Oasis towns lost strategic importance, and the balance of global commerce gradually shifted toward ports, galleys, and ocean-going empires. This was a period of transition, a slow reorientation of Eurasia's economic and cultural arteries from land to sea, marking the beginning of the Silk Road's final centuries as a dominant conduit of long-distance exchange. The collapse of centralized Mongol authority fragmented Central Asia politically. The Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty remnants in China struggled to maintain control over vast, sparsely populated regions. Local rulers, tribal confederations, and nomadic groups now dominated much of the former imperial territory, often prioritizing territorial defense or local interests over long-distance trade. Caravans faced increased insecurity as banditry, taxation by multiple authorities, and conflict along traditional routes made overland journeys costly and dangerous. Merchants were forced to adapt, either by paying exorbitant tolls or by seeking alternative paths that circumvented contested regions. Simultaneously, the rise of powerful maritime states in Asia, the Middle East, and Europe began to redefine global trade networks. In the Indian Ocean, Muslim sultanates, Gujarat, Malacca, and the Ming dynasty in China increasingly focused on sea routes for the transport of bulk goods such as spices, textiles, and ceramics. These maritime pathways allowed faster, safer, and more predictable trade than the arduous overland journey through deserts and mountains, while silk, precious stones, and high-value commodities continued to move along the Silk Road. The bulk of trade, especially lower-value, heavier goods, shifted toward the oceans. China, under the early Ming dynasty, was a major driver of this maritime transition. Following the fall of the Yuan dynasty in 1368, the Ming emperors initially revived overland trade, but quickly recognized the strategic potential of maritime commerce. The early 15th century saw the expeditions of Admiral Zheng He, whose fleets navigated the Indian Ocean from Southeast Asia to the Arabian Peninsula and East Africa. These voyages established Chinese influence, projected power, and facilitated large-scale exchange, demonstrating the logistical superiority of maritime trade. Although the Silk Road remained a route for luxury goods, oceanic routes now offered a more reliable alternative for long-distance commerce. Europe's expanding ambitions also contributed to the shift. Portuguese, Spanish, and later Dutch and English navigators sought direct access to Asian markets by sea, circumventing intermediaries along the Silk Road. The overland routes, once dominated by Islamic and Central Asian intermediaries, were increasingly seen as indirect and politically unstable. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, European demand for silk, spices, porcelain, and other Asian luxuries was largely channeled through ports such as Goa, Malacca, and Lisbon, reducing reliance on traditional caravan networks. The Silk Road's influence waned not because it ceased to function, but because maritime alternatives offered speed, volume, and security that overland routes could no longer guarantee. Environmental factors accelerated this transition. Shifting river courses, desertification, and the changing climate of Central Asia made many caravan routes more treacherous. Oasis towns that once served as vital hubs declined as water supplies dwindled, reducing their ability to support merchants and travelers. Caravans increasingly had to navigate longer and more dangerous stretches of desert, raising costs and risks. Coupled with the political instability of post-Mongol Central Asia, these environmental pressures made overland trade less attractive than maritime options. Despite these challenges, the Silk Road did not disappear. Luxury goods, particularly Chinese silk, Persian carpets, and Indian spices, continued to travel overland. The network also retained its role in the transmission of ideas, technologies, and culture. Religious communities, including Buddhists, Christians, and Muslims, maintained contact across regions, and manuscripts, scientific instruments, and artistic styles continued to circulate. The Silk Road's intellectual and cultural significance endured, even as its economic centrality diminished. Caravanserais, monasteries, and urban hubs continued to function as nodes in a network that was gradually losing its primacy to the ocean. The late Silk Road period also saw intensified regional competition among Central Asian powers. The Uzbeks, Timurids, and later the Safavids in Persia each sought to control trade routes and cities along the old Silk Road. Timur, in particular, sought to revive the glory of Central Asia as a hub of commerce and culture in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. His campaigns destroyed some cities, but also revitalized others, including Samarkand. which he made a center of art, architecture, and scholarship. Such episodes illustrate the uneven nature of the Silk Road's persistence. Its survival depended on the ambitions, capabilities, and policies of regional rulers. Europeans' growing reliance on maritime trade, coupled with Ottoman expansion in the Middle East, further reduced the overland Silk Road's importance. The capture of Constantinople in 1453 and the consolidation of Ottoman control over Anatolia and the Levant altered traditional routes to the Mediterranean. European merchants, facing higher costs and obstacles on land, increasingly sought sea-based alternatives. Venice, Genoa, and later Lisbon and Antwerp became central hubs in networks that connected Europe with Asia, effectively bypassing much of the Silk Road's historical territory. Overland caravans survived, but were increasingly marginal in the global economy. By the end of the 15th century, the Silk Road existed primarily as a network of specialized corridors for high-value luxury goods, intellectual exchange, and cultural transmission. Its role as the primary artery of Eurasian trade had diminished, yet its symbolic and practical legacy persisted. Silk continued to move westward. Artisans and scholars traveled between regions, and the historical memory of the route sustained its importance in regional economies. The transition from land to sea did not erase the Silk Road, it transformed it, creating a hybrid system in which maritime routes dominated volume and speed, while overland routes retained prestige, tradition, and niche functions. This period also marked the globalization of trade in new ways. Connections between Europe, the Middle East, India, and East Asia expanded, integrating distant economies into a single, if uneven, system. The Silk Road's decline in dominance reflected broader shifts in technology, politics, and strategy. Navigational innovations, maritime empires, and centralized naval power reshaped the landscape of commerce. Yet the ideas, religions, and cultural practices that had traveled the Silk Road for centuries continued to influence societies across Eurasia, illustrating that its legacy was more enduring than its economic function. By the early 16th century, the Silk Road had entered its final centuries as an overland network. Its glory days as a continental trade artery were over, replaced by maritime supremacy, centralized states, and oceanic empires. Yet the patterns it had established, interconnected markets, cosmopolitan cities, religious tolerance, and intellectual exchange, endured, providing a foundation for the interconnected world that would emerge during the early modern period. The Silk Road was no longer central to the flow of goods, but it remained a living symbol of human ambition, resilience, and the enduring desire to connect across vast distances. By the 17th century, the Silk Road had largely ceased to function as the central artery of Eurasian commerce. The once vast network of caravan routes, oases, and cities that had stretched from the heart of China to the Mediterranean had been eclipsed by maritime trade, newly centralized states, and the global ambitions of European powers. Yet, to declare the Silk Road dead would be to overlook its enduring impact. Though diminished in economic importance, it remained a conduit for cultural exchange, ideas, and innovation. Its story, spanning 2 millennia, offers a window into the interconnectedness of human civilizations, revealing patterns of cooperation, conflict, and creativity that shape the modern world. The shift from overland to maritime trade was driven by a combination of political, technological, and economic forces. European powers, particularly Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and later England, sought direct access to Asian markets, circumventing intermediaries along traditional land routes. Navigational advances, including the astrolabe, improved cartography, and larger ocean-going vessels allowed merchants to transport larger volumes of goods more efficiently and safely. Sea routes, though not without hazards, offered predictable passage and bypassed politically fragmented regions that had long complicated overland trade. The Maritime Revolution effectively marginalized much of the Silk Road's commercial function. In Central Asia, the legacy of centuries of Silk Road trade persisted in urban centers, cultural practices, and human networks. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar, though less critical to global commerce, remained vibrant hubs of learning, craftsmanship, and regional trade. Caravan routes continued to operate for local and high-value luxury goods, particularly Chinese silk, Central Asian horses, and spices. Scholars, artisans, and religious communities sustained cross-cultural interactions, ensuring that the intellectual and spiritual currents of the Silk Road endured long after the caravans had thinned. These centers became repositories of cultural memory, preserving manuscripts, artistic techniques, and architectural styles that bore the imprint of centuries of Eurasian exchange. The Silk Road's role in the diffusion of religion and philosophy continued to resonate. Buddhism, which had traveled east from India via Central Asia, persisted in China and beyond, while Islamic scholarship flourished along former trade corridors. Christianity, Manichaeism, Zoroastrianism, and other faiths left enduring legacies in art, architecture, and literary traditions. Cultural hybridity, one of the Silk Road's defining characteristics, persisted even as political and economic conditions changed. The movement of ideas, artistic motifs, and scientific knowledge ensured that the Silk Road's influence extended far beyond the physical movement of commodities. China's own relationship with overland trade had shifted dramatically by this period. The Ming dynasty's focus on maritime expeditions, coupled with the later Qing dynasty's policies, reduced incentives for large-scale overland commerce. Caravans continued to operate, particularly in the northwest and along established frontier routes, but the scale and centrality of these operations could not compare to earlier eras. Nevertheless, Chinese goods, especially silk, porcelain, and tea, remained prized commodities in international markets, often traveling indirectly via maritime networks. The Silk Road had become a secondary, symbolic pathway, its historical imprint enduring even as its economic prominence waned. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire controlled many former Silk Road corridors, yet it too recognized the rising importance of maritime trade. The Levantine ports became conduits for goods from India and China, arriving via the Indian Ocean, often bypassing the overland routes entirely. European demand for Eastern luxuries was met increasingly through ports such as Alexandria, Venice, and Lisbon. Central Asia, once the beating heart of Silk Road commerce, was now a periphery, while the ocean became the new highway of globalization. Despite this decline, the Silk Road's intellectual and cultural legacy remained potent. Scientific instruments, mathematical techniques, medical knowledge, and artistic motifs continued to circulate along secondary routes. Scholars from Persia traveled east, while Chinese inventions such as printing and gunpowder moved westward. Ideas once transmitted along the Silk Road laid the foundation for later Renaissance and Enlightenment advancements in Europe, highlighting the indirect yet profound ways in which the network shaped global history. The human dimension of the Silk Road also persisted. Merchants, caravaneers, and pilgrims maintained traditions honed over centuries: long-distance negotiation, multilingual communication, and sophisticated knowledge of geography and logistics. These skills were passed down through generations, forming a living memory of Eurasian connectivity. Even as maritime routes dominated, the ethos of the Silk Road, adaptability, intercultural dialogue, and the pursuit of opportunity across vast distances continued to influence the behavior and imagination of peoples far beyond Central Asia. Environmental and geopolitical changes further sealed the Silk Road's decline. Desertification, river shifts, and the fragmentation of Central Asian polities made overland commerce increasingly difficult. Nomadic incursions, previously a fixture of Silk Road life, continued to threaten caravans, while the rise of powerful centralized empires in both East Asia and the Middle East redirected resources and attention toward maritime strategies. By the 17th century, the Silk Road existed more as a historical memory and regional network than as the primary conduit of Eurasian exchange. Yet the lessons of the Silk Road endured. It demonstrated the profound possibilities of long-distance interaction, the ways in which commerce can foster cultural and technological exchange, and the fragility of networks in the face of political and environmental instability. Its history shaped the imagination of later generations, inspiring explorers, geographers, and merchants to seek ever greater connections across continents. The Silk Road was, in essence, a crucible in which the foundations of globalization were forged centuries before the modern era. The Silk Road's end did not signify the cessation of exchange. Rather, it marked a transformation. The knowledge, practices, and cultural hybridity that had flowed along its routes diffused into maritime trade networks, colonial empires, and early global markets. Its cities, religious institutions, and caravan networks provided models for trade, administration, and cultural integration elsewhere. Even in decline, the Silk Road continued to shape societies, economies, and intellectual currents across Eurasia. In retrospect, the Silk Road stands as one of history's most remarkable achievements. Over 2 millennia, it facilitated the movement of silk, spices, precious metals, religions, art, and ideas across deserts, mountains, and rivers. Empires rose and fell, cities flourished and decayed, yet the vision of a connected world endured. The Silk Road illustrates the duality of human enterprise, the capacity for cooperation, creativity, and exchange, alongside the potential for conflict, disruption, and disease. It is both a story of material wealth and human ingenuity, a testament to the enduring desire to reach beyond immediate horizons and connect distant civilizations. By the 18th century, the Silk Road existed largely as a historical echo, its caravanserais and oasis towns quieter than in centuries past, yet its imprint on human civilization was indelible. From the spread of religions to the transmission of technology, from artistic synthesis to the foundations of global trade, the Silk Road shaped the trajectory of Eurasian history in ways that continue to resonate today. It remains a powerful symbol of connectivity, reminding us that the movement of people, goods, and ideas across great distances has always been central to the story of humanity. The Silk Road had run its course as the primary route of long-distance commerce, but its legacy lived on in every road, port, and network that followed. Its history embodies both the brilliance and fragility of human endeavor, the fleeting nature of political dominance, and the enduring power of ideas, culture, and human ambition. From its beginnings in the deserts of China and Central Asia to its final transformation in the age of global maritime empires, the Silk Road tells a story of human connectivity unparalleled in scope and enduring in influence. It is a reminder that even when empires fade and routes are abandoned, the human drive to connect, exchange, and explore persists, shaping the world in ways both tangible and invisible.